I have to sort of go back to the origins of this story and its connection to my hometown of Norwich, Connecticut. When I would have been about 8 years old, when a guy named Ellis Rouy was found frozen. His body was found frozen at the bottom of a long, steep driveway, and there was a blood trail from his house all the way down the driveway. Now, Ellis, and I didn't, I was not, aware of this back when I was 9 years old. I found this out through research, but I became aware of Ellis Rouy because he became posthumously a very successful and collectible folk artist. He had painted in the 30s and 40s and 50s. He had been a laborer, and then just began to paint obsessively without quite knowing why he was doing it, but it became sort of his life. Now, Ellis Rouy was African American, and he was the first, as far as I could see in my research, he was the first African American Norwich native to have a white wife. He had married a German immigrant named Wilhelmina, and because of that, and because he had won a substantial settlement because of an accident he was involved in, a car accident with a local company. He got a settlement. He was able to buy property. He was able to buy a really, very expensive Buick, and he would drive through town in his Buick with his white wife beside him, and he became a target to the racists in town. And not too long after his body was found, the coroner decided it was an accidental death, but the black community was sure he had been murdered. Maybe within a month after that, his house burned to the ground. And what was assumed was that all of those paintings that he had been doing all those years and never being able to sell probably went up in flames as well. But then something weird happened in the 70s and 80s. They began to show up, these paintings, at house sales in Pennsylvania and in other states. So so there's a mystery involved with the actual Ellis Rouy story, which I kind of took as my own and then began to fictionalize around that. Now, the other antecedent is the fact that when I was 12 years old, 1963, in March of that year, a dam burst at the northern part of Norwich and unleashed, I think, what must have been like 6-7 million gallons of water that went rushing down and destroyed the city and took 5 lives. There were 4 people who had been working on in the night shift at a mill, a local mill, and the raging water collapsed the mill, and they were buried alive. The 5th person who died was a young mother. She was in her 20s. She had 3 kids, 3 sons. She and her husband were both very young. The kids were ages 4 and 2 and I think 7 months, something like that. And the mother and father got word just before the water came that that the dam had broke and a flood was coming, and they made the fateful decision to try to outrun the water. So the father and mother and the 3 little boys and an upstairs neighbor, a young man who was, I think, 19 at the time, got in the car and they were racing away from the scene. And then the water came, carried the car. It was a station wagon, I think, and flipped it over a wall, and they all went underwater. And they got out of the car, and the neighbor and the father were putting the 3 children up into a tree, and they went back to get the mother. She was the last to be rescued, and the father and mother, they were holding hands, and then the water carried her away, and she drowned. Now, the floodwater came very close to our house, maybe 2 or 3 houses down. And so I remember I remember I was watching the Beverly Hillbillies on a Wednesday evening, and my father was part of the emergency people who had to respond. And I remember walking down the street, just a couple houses, with my mother and seeing this, I could still hear the roar of the water, and I could see these big slabs of ice from the top of the lake that, that the dam had held back, shooting past, trees and cars floating by. I remember hearing the screams from the people in the that were buried in the mill rubble, and so that stayed with me. And I remember particularly reading. I read everything in the subsequently in the local newspaper, and I remember particularly feeling very sort of very moved by the plight of those three little boys in the tree. And so then decades go by. It's 2009. I am promoting Wishing and Hoping, my little, funny little Christmas book, and I do a local radio show in my hometown. And the announcer says, "So what's next for Wally Lamb?" And had I told the truth, I would have said, I don't know, but I didn't want to appear as stupid as I actually am, and so I grabbed something out of the air. I said, maybe I'll write about the flood. Well, if you come from Norwich, the flood means that something. Flood. Yeah,
everyone knows that.
And so about, I don't know, less than a week later, I get a call from somebody who had heard that interview, a local woman, and she said, "Oh, those three little boys that you were talking about, they're my cousins, and they are now in their early 50s. And so she connected me to the oldest son, who has all his life been obsessed with, his mother's drowning. He's the only one of the three who has any memory of that actual night, and also any memory of his mother. Anyway, he and I connected. He wrote, he's an engineer, and so he wrote the very fact-based, real story of the dam breaking and so forth. And I, of course, bounced off with it fictionally. But we helped each other with one another's projects. And then we met with that then 19-year-old neighbor who is now in his late 60s, and the three sons and I. A couple of summers ago, we met at the place where the now fortified dam is, and we walked the flood path down. And probably one of the most moving things of my life was when the neighbor and the oldest son and a little bit me, we figured out which tree
that they had sat in.
Yeah, and they called it. They've now put a plaque on it. It's called the Tree of Life. And so, that's how all of that sort of came together.